The Super Bowl. It's not just a football game, it's the final chapter of every NFL season, the biggest stage in American sports and the place where legends are made or broken in 4 quarters. And today we're diving into all of them. Every matchup, every MVP, every unforgettable moment. This is the full journey from Super Bowl I to the present. Let's break it all down. The birth of a juggernaut. Super Bowl I to IV. The Super Bowl didn't just appear out of nowhere, it came out of a rivalry. Back in the 1960s, professional football in the U.S. was split between two leagues, the long-established NFL and the upstart AFL. And for years, the NFL looked down on the AFL like it was some minor league experiment. But by the mid-60s, the AFL had started to grow. It had money, it had fans, and more importantly, it had talented players. The tension between the two leagues eventually led to a full-blown merger agreement in 1966. And to settle the score, they decided the champions of each league would face off in a brand new game. That game would be the Super Bowl. Super Bowl I, played in January 1967, wasn't the spectacle it is today. There were over 30,000 empty seats at the LA Memorial Coliseum. But on the field, it was all business. Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers made sure everyone knew which league was still in charge, beating the Kansas City Chiefs 35-10. It wasn't even close. The NFL flexed its muscles, and Lombardi's name would eventually become the one engraved on the Super Bowl trophy. That's how dominant he was. The Packers came back and did it again in Super Bowl II, this time against the Oakland Raiders. It was another beatdown, 33-14, and it reinforced the idea that the NFL was simply on another level. At least that's what everyone thought, until Super Bowl III. That's where Joe Namath changed everything. The New York Jets weren't supposed to win. The Colts were NFL royalty. But just days before the game, Namath, brash, confident, and full of swagger, famously guaranteed a Jets victory. And against all odds, he delivered. The Jets stunned the football world with a 16-7 win. Namath didn't even throw a touchdown pass in that game, but the way he controlled the offense and kept Baltimore off balance earned him MVP honors. That win gave the AFL instant credibility. It wasn't just a one-off either. In Super Bowl IV, the Kansas City Chiefs, the same team that got blown out in the first Super Bowl, came back and dominated the Minnesota Vikings 23-7. This wasn't a fluke, it was a statement. The AFL could not only compete, they could win convincingly. Those first 4 Super Bowls laid the foundation for what the game would become. It settled the tension between leagues, proved the merger was the right call, and showed fans across the country that anything could happen on Super Bowl Sunday. Next up, the 1970s, where defenses ruled, rivalries exploded, and the Super Bowl started to become the massive cultural event we know today. The 70s powerhouses, Super Bowl V to 14. Now that the merger was complete, the Super Bowl became the ultimate decider, not just between leagues, but between the best of the best. And the 1970s, that was the decade when teams stopped treating the Super Bowl like a prize and started chasing it like an obsession. Let's start with Super Bowl V, which is often called the Blunder Bowl. And honestly, that's fair. It was chaotic, full of turnovers, penalties, missed kicks. Both the Colts and Cowboys seemed to struggle with the moment, but in the end, the Colts won it on a last-second field goal. 16-13. The game was messy, but it proved something. The Super Bowl wasn't going to be won on talent alone. Discipline mattered. Execution mattered. Then came the Dallas Cowboys, and Tom Landry's team would define the decade in so many ways. They finally got their first title in Super Bowl VI, completely shutting down the Dolphins 24-3. That defense? Relentless. That offense, clinical. The Cowboys weren't flashy, they were efficient. And from this point on, people started calling them America's team. But this decade truly belonged to one franchise, the Pittsburgh Steelers. From 1974 to 1979, they won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years, a dynasty that hasn't been matched in terms of sheer dominance across both sides of the ball. In Super Bowl IX, they ground out a tough win over the Vikings, 16-6. It wasn't pretty, but their defense, famously called the Steel Curtain, absolutely smothered Minnesota. Then they followed that up with a 21-17 win over the Cowboys in Super Bowl X. That's where Lynn Swann made one of the most graceful catches in Super Bowl history. Airborne, spinning, perfect form. It wasn't just football. It was artistry. By Super Bowl XIII, it was Steelers versus Cowboys again. This time it was more explosive. Bradshaw threw for over 300 yards. Swann and Stallworth went off, and Pittsburgh won 35-31 in what many still call one of the best Super Bowls ever played. And then came Super Bowl XIV, where the Steelers took down the Rams 31-19. That made it 4 titles for Pittsburgh. Bradshaw had evolved into a true big-game quarterback, and Chuck Noll became the first coach with 4 rings. The Steelers had built something that felt unstoppable. Talent, toughness, and complete control of the moment. Meanwhile, other teams made their mark too. The Miami Dolphins, led by Don Shula, completed the only perfect season in NFL history in 1972, capping it off with a win in Super Bowl VII. Think about that. Undefeated from Week 1 to the Lombardi Trophy. No one has done it since. They came back and won it again in Super Bowl VIII, just to remind everyone it wasn't a fluke. Even the Oakland Raiders broke through in Super Bowl XI, behind John Madden and a punishing run game. Fred Biletnikoff carved up defenses with surgical precision, and their physicality overwhelmed the Vikings. By the end of the 70s, the Super Bowl had evolved. It wasn't just a championship anymore. It was a stage for defining legacies. Teams like the Steelers, Cowboys, Dolphins, and Raiders didn't just want to win games. They wanted to dominate history. And that hunger for greatness, it only grew louder in the next decade when quarterbacks took center stage and a guy named Joe Montana rewrote what it meant to perform under pressure. By the way, if you are enjoying this video, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you, the 80s quarterback revolution. Super Bowl 15-24. This was a decade where everything changed. If the 70s were about physicality and defense, the 80s were all about quarterbacks taking over. Teams started putting the ball in the hands of their stars, and the Super Bowl became a showcase for elite offensive minds and clutch performers under pressure. It kicked off with Super Bowl 15, where the Oakland Raiders, now led by Jim Plunkett, became the first wildcard team to win it all. They beat the Eagles 27-10, and Plunkett's redemption arc was complete. He had been written off by most of the league before landing in Oakland, and now he was a Super Bowl MVP. It set the tone for the underdog stories that would run through this era. But the team that truly dominated the 80s, the San Francisco 49ers. In Super Bowl 16, a young Joe Montana led the 49ers to their first title, beating the Bengals 26-21. It was Montana's calmness in the pocket, his surgical accuracy, and the brilliance of Bill Walsh's West Coast offense that stunned defenses. They didn't rely on deep bombs. It was precision, rhythm, and timing, and no one ran it better than Montana. 2 years later, in Super Bowl 19, Montana was back, and this time he went toe-to-toe with Dan Marino and the Miami Dolphins. Marino had just thrown for over 5,000 yards that season, unheard of at the time. People thought he'd light it up, but the 49ers were too complete, too well prepared. Montana dominated again, winning 38-16 and grabbing his second Super Bowl MVP. But the 80s weren't just about the 49ers. The Washington Redskins, led by Joe Gibbs, were building something just as impressive. In Super Bowl 17, they leaned on running back John Riggins, who bulldozed through defenders on his way to a 43-yard touchdown run that sealed the game. That play became legendary. Pure willpower, nothing fancy. Then in Super Bowl 22, Washington made history again. Doug Williams became the first black quarterback to start and win a Super Bowl. And he did it in style, throwing 4 touchdown passes in 1 quarter against the Broncos. A moment that went beyond the field. It was history being made right there on Super Bowl Sunday. The Chicago Bears brought a different kind of energy in Super Bowl 20. That team was ruthless. Their defense under Buddy Ryan was suffocating, and they rolled over the Patriots 46-10. You can't talk about the 80s without mentioning that 85 Bears squad. They didn't just win, they demolished. And that dominance, especially on defense, still gets referenced to this day. But once again, the 49ers rose above it all. In Super Bowl 23, they were down late against the Bengals. With 3:10 left on the clock and the ball at their own 8-yard line, Montana orchestrated one of the greatest game-winning drives in NFL history. Calm as ever, he drove 92 yards and found John Taylor for the game-winning touchdown with 34 seconds left. That's what made Montana special. The moment never seemed too big. And then came Super Bowl 24, where the 49ers put a bow on the decade with a 55-10 demolition of the Denver Broncos. Still the most lopsided Super Bowl in history. Montana threw 5 touchdown passes. The 49ers had become the gold standard, and Montana had 4 rings to show for it. By the end of the 80s, the Super Bowl had evolved again. It was no longer just about who had the better defense or ground game. Now you needed the quarterback. You needed someone who could stay calm, read the field, and make the right decision with everything on the line. But in the 90s, things got wild. Quarterbacks were still king, but now dynasties collided, heartbreaks piled up, and a new generation of superstars took center stage. Let's dive into the chaos of the 90s. The 90s chaos, dynasties, and heartbreak. Super Bowl 25-34. The 1990s didn't waste time. Right from the start, it gave us one of the most intense and heartbreaking finishes in Super Bowl history. Super Bowl 25, Giants versus Bills. The Bills were on the rise, fast-paced and explosive on offense. The Giants, on the other hand, played methodical, controlled football. The game went down to the wire. With just seconds left, Buffalo had a chance to win it. Scott Norwood, 47-yard field goal attempt. He kicked it and missed. Wide right. Giants won 2019, and just like that, the Bills' Super Bowl nightmare began. Because here's the thing. Buffalo didn't just lose one. They went to 4 straight Super Bowls and lost every single one. In Super Bowl 26, Washington, led by Mark Rypien and one of the best offensive lines in NFL history, completely outclassed them. The Bills couldn't stop the pass rush, couldn't get into rhythm. 37-24, and it wasn't even that close. Then came Super Bowl 27, and it was the Dallas Cowboys' time. Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, Michael Irvin, that trio ran the show. They destroyed the Bills 52-17. Dallas forced 9 turnovers. It was one of the most lopsided games in Super Bowl history. And just to make it worse for Buffalo, they got a rematch in Super Bowl 28 and lost again. Emmitt Smith dominated the second half. Dallas took control and never looked back, 30-13. That was the start of a dynasty. The Cowboys went on to win 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, 27, 28, and 30, where they beat the Steelers 27-17. By then, they were a machine. Jimmy Johnson built the core, Barry Switzer carried it over the line, and the Cowboys became the team of the 90s. But it wasn't a clean sweep. The San Francisco 49ers weren't going to just fade into the background. In Super Bowl 29, they made a statement. Steve Young, finally out of Montana's shadow, threw 6 touchdown passes against the Chargers. 6. He literally said after the game that he was pulling the monkey off his back. That game was him saying, "I'm not just the guy who replaced Montana, I'm a legend in my own right." Then came Super Bowl 32, and it was finally time for John Elway to get his ring. He had lost 3 Super Bowls in the 80s, all blowouts. People questioned if he had what it took. But in this one, against the Packers, Elway didn't carry the game with stats. He carried it with grit. Remember that helicopter spin on 3rd down? That's the play that defined it. Denver won 31-24, and Elway finally had his moment. And just to make sure no one called it a fluke, the Broncos came back and won again in Super Bowl 33, beating the Falcons. This time, Elway took home the MVP, and with that, he walked off a champion. Back-to-back titles and a legacy finally sealed. The 90s also gave us the greatest show on turf, the St. Louis Rams. In Super Bowl 34, they faced the Tennessee Titans, and the game came down to literally the final yard. Kevin Dyson caught a pass, turned upfield, reached for the end zone, and was tackled 1 yard short. Time expired. Rams won 23-16. It was one of the most dramatic finishes the Super Bowl has ever seen. By the end of the 90s, the Super Bowl had seen it all. Dynasties in Dallas and Denver, heartbreaks in Buffalo, and the beginning of high-octane offenses that could score from anywhere. Teams weren't just trying to win anymore. They were building identities. They were chasing something bigger: legacy, greatness, history. But if you thought the 90s were dramatic, the 2000s took it to another level. A 6th-round draft pick named Tom Brady was about to flip the league upside down and build a dynasty that would stretch for 2 decades. Let's step into the era of the Patriots. The 2000s, the Patriots era begins, Super Bowl 35-44. The 2000s changed everything. This was the decade when the Super Bowl stopped being just a championship game and became the backdrop for the rise of the most dominant dynasty in modern NFL history, the New England Patriots. But before they took over, the decade started with a reminder of how powerful defense still was. In Super Bowl 35, the Baltimore Ravens put on one of the most suffocating defensive performances you'll ever see. Ray Lewis, in his prime, led a unit that overwhelmed the New York Giants from start to finish. The Ravens didn't allow a single offensive touchdown. The game finished 34-7, and it wasn't even that close. That defense carried a very average offense to the top, pure dominance. Then everything shifted in Super Bowl 36. The St. Louis Rams came in as the heavy favorites. They were the greatest show on turf, high-flying, fast-paced, impossible to stop. But on the other side was a young quarterback, drafted 199th overall, named Tom Brady. He had taken over for an injured Drew Bledsoe earlier in the season, and now he was in the biggest game of his life. And he delivered. The Patriots didn't flinch. They held the Rams to just 17 points and won it on a last-second field goal from Adam Vinatieri. That was the birth of a dynasty. Super Bowl 38, Brady did it again, this time against the Panthers. Back and forth all game. But when it mattered most, Brady marched down the field and set up another Vinatieri game winner. Same thing in Super Bowl 39 against the Eagles. Not flashy, not overwhelming, just efficient, composed, and ruthless in the final moments. 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. Brady and Belichick had arrived. In between all that, Super Bowl 37 reminded everyone that coaching and preparation still matter. John Gruden led the Tampa Bay Buccaneers against his former team, the Raiders, the very offense he helped design. Tampa's defense picked it apart, scoring multiple defensive touchdowns in a 48-21 win. That wasn't a coincidence. That was film room mastery meeting elite execution on the field. By the mid-2000s, the Patriots were chasing perfection, and in 2007, they nearly pulled it off. They went 16-0 in the regular season, then dominated the playoffs. Enter Super Bowl 42, Patriots versus Giants. Everyone expected a blowout. But the Giants' defensive line changed the game. Brady was under pressure all night, and with just over a minute left, Eli Manning pulled off one of the most iconic plays in NFL history, escaping a sack and launching it downfield to David Tyree, who somehow pinned the ball against his helmet while being tackled. That led to the game-winning touchdown. Giants 17, Patriots 14. Perfect season. Gone. One of the biggest upsets ever. In Super Bowl 43, we got a classic. Steelers versus Cardinals. Larry Fitzgerald had just ripped through Pittsburgh's defense for a go-ahead touchdown with under 3 minutes to go. But Ben Roethlisberger answered with a perfect 2-minute drill. And then came Santonio Holmes in the back corner of the end zone. Tiptoes inbounds, full stretch. That catch sealed it. Steelers won 27-23, and that moment instantly became part of Super Bowl lore. And then in Super Bowl 44, the story shifted again, this time to New Orleans. Just a few years after Hurricane Katrina devastated the city, the Saints, led by Drew Brees, were in the big game against Peyton Manning's Colts. Everyone remembers the surprise onside kick to start the second half. Bold, fearless, and perfectly executed. It flipped the momentum. Brees took over, and Tracy Porter's pick six sealed it. Final score, 31-17. The Saints didn't just win, they brought a city back to life. By the end of the 2000s, the Patriots had cemented themselves as the team of the decade. But more than that, the Super Bowl had become a platform for unforgettable moments, career-defining plays, and dramatic swings. Offense, defense, coaching, every detail mattered. And as the 2010s rolled in, things only got crazier. Quarterbacks became the center of everything, new dynasties started rising, and one play, one decision, could define an entire legacy. The 2010s quarterbacks, comebacks, and controversy. Super Bowl 45-54. The 2010s were a decade where quarterbacks took over like never before. If the Super Bowl was a stage, then this was the era where the biggest stars delivered the most unforgettable performances. And at the heart of it all, legendary duels, dramatic comebacks, and plays that still spark debates years later. It started with Super Bowl 45. The Green Bay Packers, led by Aaron Rodgers, took on the Pittsburgh Steelers. This was Rodgers' moment, the game that elevated him from elite talent to Super Bowl champion. He was flawless, throwing for over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. The Packers won 31-25, and Rodgers took home MVP. That was the peak of that Packers team. Fast, efficient, explosive. And Rodgers, at his best, looked like he could dominate the next decade. Then came the New York Giants again in Super Bowl 46, and once again they faced Tom Brady and the Patriots. It felt like déjà vu, and just like before, the Giants' defense made Brady uncomfortable, and Eli Manning pulled off another magical drive, this time featuring an inch-perfect throw to Mario Manningham down the sideline. Giants won 21-17. That was Brady's second Super Bowl loss to the same team and quarterback. Eli wasn't the best regular season guy, but in the Super Bowl, he delivered. But perhaps the most complete team of the era was the Seattle Seahawks. In Super Bowl 48, they overwhelmed Peyton Manning and the top-ranked Broncos offense. That game was over almost as soon as it started. The Seahawks scored on the first play from scrimmage, a safety, and the defense, led by the Legion of Boom, never let up. Final score, 43-8. That wasn't just a win, that was a statement. And then, in Super Bowl 49, they were back, this time against the Patriots. This was supposed to be the game where Seattle cemented their dynasty. They were on the 1-yard line. Seconds left, down by 4. Everyone expected a run by Marshawn Lynch, but instead, they passed. And Malcolm Butler, an undrafted rookie, jumped the route and made one of the most iconic interceptions in NFL history. Patriots won 28-24. That one play changed everything for both franchises. Super Bowl 50 gave us a different kind of story. Peyton Manning, the very end of his career, facing off against a young Cam Newton and the Carolina Panthers. It wasn't Manning's best performance, but Denver's defense was unbelievable. Von Miller dominated the game, and the Broncos won 24-10. Manning retired a champion, and that defense carried him across the finish line. Then came Super Bowl 51, probably the most shocking comeback ever. The Falcons were up 28-3 late in the third quarter against the Patriots. The game looked over, but then Brady started chipping away. The defense stepped up. Julian Edelman made an impossible catch in triple coverage, and by the time James White scored in overtime, the first OT in Super Bowl history, the Patriots had pulled off the greatest comeback the game has ever seen. 34-28. Brady won his 5th ring. That game, pure madness. In Super Bowl 52, the Eagles broke through. Nick Foles, the backup, went toe-to-toe with Brady and won. The Philly special trick play became an instant classic, a gutsy call on 4th and goal that completely flipped the momentum. Eagles won 41-33, and that city finally got its championship. Super Bowl 53 was a defensive war. Patriots versus Rams, a rematch of that first Brady-Belichick title. This time the game was ugly, slow, but the Patriots did just enough. A late touchdown to Sony Michel sealed a 13-3 win. It was Belichick's masterpiece. He completely shut down the high-powered Rams offense. And finally, Super Bowl 54, the beginning of something new. The Kansas City Chiefs, led by Patrick Mahomes, were down 20-10 with just over 6 minutes to play. And then Mahomes did what only he can, scored 3 touchdowns in a flash. The Chiefs beat the 49ers 31-20, and Mahomes was named MVP. That wasn't just a win, it felt like a passing of the torch. By the end of the 2010s, Brady had gone from clutch kid to all-time great. The Patriots had built a dynasty of their own, and Mahomes had kicked off a new era. Super Bowls became more unpredictable and more explosive, and every single year came down to 1 or 2 plays that defined everything. And that takes us into the 2020s, where dominance continued, new stars emerged, and one franchise rose to the top as the NFL's next great powerhouse. Let's talk about the Super Bowls of today. The 2020s, a new dynasty, new faces, and the return of the Eagles. Super Bowl 55-59. The 2020s kicked off with uncertainty. Stadiums were empty, protocols were strict, and yet the Super Bowl stage still delivered. If the 2010s were about Brady's reign and the rise of Mahomes, the 2020s opened the door for fresh narratives and a changing of the guard. Super Bowl 55 in 2021 was supposed to be the true passing of the torch. Mahomes had just led the Chiefs to back-to-back Super Bowls, and now he was facing the greatest to ever do it, Tom Brady, this time in a Buccaneers jersey. Tampa Bay's defense took over that game. Mahomes was pressured on almost every snap. He ran for nearly 500 yards behind the line of scrimmage just trying to stay alive. The final score? 31-9. Not only was it a blowout, but it was Brady's 7th ring, Flo, the most by any player, more than any franchise. At age 43, he didn't just win, he dominated, and he did it with a brand new team. Then came Super Bowl 56, and a Hollywood ending. The Los Angeles Rams, playing in their home stadium, took on the Cincinnati Bengals, a young, fearless team led by Joe Burrow. It was tight, physical, and came down to a clutch fourth-quarter drive. Matthew Stafford, after years of losing in Detroit, delivered when it mattered most. He found Cooper Kupp for the go-ahead touchdown, and Aaron Donald sealed it with a game-ending pressure. Rams won 23-20. For a franchise that had taken a win-now gamble by trading picks for stars, it paid off. But if there's one team that truly defined this era, it's the Kansas City Chiefs. In Super Bowl 57, Mahomes came in playing on an injured ankle and still managed to deliver a near-perfect second half against the Eagles. He threw 3 touchdown passes and engineered a game-winning drive that ended in a field goal with just seconds left. Final score, 38-35. Mahomes won his 2nd ring and 2nd Super Bowl MVP. And at just 27 years old, it was clear. The Chiefs weren't just contenders. They were building a dynasty, and they cemented that in Super Bowl 58 with another epic. Chiefs versus 49 ERs, a rematch of the game they played 4 years earlier. This one went to overtime, only the 2nd time that's ever happened in Super Bowl history. The Niners struck first with a field goal, but Mahomes, again, marched the Chiefs down the field, finishing it with a walk-off touchdown pass. 25-22, back-to-back titles. 3 Super Bowls in 5 years, no more questions. This was their era. But then came Super Bowl 59 in 2025, and everything shifted. The Philadelphia Eagles, after heartbreak 2 years earlier, were back, and this time, they were ready. Led by Jalen Hurts, who had grown into one of the league's most complete quarterbacks, and backed by a relentless defense, the Eagles controlled the pace from the start. They took on Patrick Mahomes' Kansas City Chiefs, but Philly never let him get comfortable. Hurts made smart decisions, converted key 3rd downs, and scored both through the air and on the ground. The final score was 40-22. The Eagles were champions again. This wasn't just redemption, it was a statement. They weren't a one-season wonder. They were built to last. So by the midpoint of the decade, here's where we stood. Brady had walked away with one last title. Mahomes had turned promise into legacy. The Eagles had returned to the top. So now that we've walked through every single Super Bowl, every title, every clutch play, every dynasty, let's pause and look at what's been built over nearly 6 decades of football history. But beyond the numbers, the Super Bowl has become something bigger than football. It's cultural, it's international. Thank you for watching.